Shavua Tov, good vach. Great to be learning with you, my holy sisters and brothers, on a Saturday night and starting the week off with some beautiful, punchy, short, quick, but really geschmack, tasty learning. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Sharon in New Jersey, Joe in the Inland Empire, Guy in Ohio, Shandor in the Bronx, Ryan in Jacksonville, Florida, Bella in Florida. Hi, I'm in Florida. Frank in San Pedro, Ella's here. Ilanit in Silver Spring, and Marjorie in Georgia. Welcome, everybody. And Bella in Texas. Welcome. We are starting the second half of Bava Basra with chapter 6. And Mishna number 1. And this, I mean, it's so practical. It's the kind of stuff that comes up all the time. In fact, we had a question that came up today at our Shabbos table. Nina and I were discussing from a wonderful book. Maybe, I think we put in the comments before, but Nina, if you could share that link to Acha Shalti. The title is based on a line from Psalm 27 that we read every day now, LeDavid, during the month of Elul, where it says, only one thing I ask of you, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, King David says. But what the books are actually about is practical halachic questions, actual Jewish legal questions that have been brought before a poskening rabbi, a great poskening rabbi, Rabbi Zillerstein in Israel. And so today's question was about basically somebody got the wrong medicine from a pharmacist. It would have been dangerous if he took it. And then the pharmacist realized the mistake, called him up, and said, just bring it back. I'll give you the right medicine, refund the difference. But the patient was really angry that, if he had taken the medicine just a little bit quicker, he could have been really injured. He wanted nothing more to do with the pharmacist. So he didn't get his money back. He just let the medicine sit on his shelf. And then later it turned out, when there was a shortage, that medicine was valuable. And somebody else needed it. The guy just gave it to him, didn't expect any reimbursement. But that guy was so happy to get the medicine in a time of need that he gave him a rather large amount of money. And then the question was, who's entitled to the money? The patient who received the wrong medicine and what was obviously a mistaken transaction, or the pharmacist who messed up, but if it was a mistaken transaction, the medicine was technically still his, and perhaps he should receive the money. So let's see if we get some insight about that question, which Nina and I happen to be studying today, connected not to the Gemara, but to the Torah portion. And let's see if we get some insight about that for the page that just happens to come up from our 7.5-year cycle on the same day we were learning that question. Page 92a, here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud, chapter 6, Mishnah number 1. With regard to one who sells produce to another that is sometimes purchased for consumption and sometimes for planting, and the buyer planted it and it did not sprout. And even if he had sold flax seeds, which are only occasionally eaten and are therefore usually used for planting, and then they don't sprout, even in the case of flax seeds, the seller does not bear financial responsibility for them, i.e. he is not required to compensate the buyer. Why? Because the buyer did not specify that he purchased the produce in order to plant it. The seller can claim that he assumed the buyer intended to eat it. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says if he sold seeds for garden plants which are not eaten at all, then the seller bears financial responsibility for them as they were certainly purchased for planting. Okay, so the basic question here is a product has an intended use, right? So seeds that are intended to be eaten don't need to have the capacity to germinate, sprout, and produce new plants. Seeds that are bought for planting obviously need to have that capacity. If the buyer doesn't tell the seller what he needs the seeds for, then the seller can assume that they're for eating, which is kind of the lower level. Cheaper seeds, they're always going to be good for eating as long as they haven't rotted. So unless he's been given to know by the buyer that he needs seeds that can germinate, the seller's not going to bear financial responsibility if this buyer then goes and plants them and they don't sprout. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. An Amoraic dispute, so a dispute between sages of the Mishnah, the period of the Mishnah, was stated with regard to one who sells an ox to another, and the ox is found to be one that habitually gores. Right? So the Torah defines the habitual goring ox. This has an increased level of liability for its owner if it then goes and injures or kills a person. And it makes sense that it would be a different level of liability if you had no reason to suspect that the ox is a dangerous ox. But if you have been given to know, you've been warned in the past that your ox is a dangerous ox, and you don't secure it, and then it breaks out and hurts someone, then you're negligent, and you're going to have a higher level of culpability and liability. Now, here we're not really discussing the laws of the goring ox. Here what we're talking about is if you have a goring ox and you sell it to someone who needs it for its meat, right, who's going to slaughter the ox, then it really doesn't matter that it's a goring ox. I mean, they can take care that it won't gore while it's being transported to the slaughterhouse. But if somebody is purchasing an ox to pull the plow, then it's a much bigger deal if it turns out to be a goring ox. So, did the buyer need to notify the seller what he wanted the ox for? Let's read. Rav says, this is a mistaken transaction, since the buyer can claim that he bought the ox specifically for labor, and an ox that gores is not suitable for this function, so therefore the seller must take back the ox and reimburse the buyer. That's Rav's opinion. Shmuel says the sale is not voided, as the seller can say to him, I sold it to you for slaughter, and the fact that it gores is immaterial. Now the Gemara suggests, but let us see if the buyer is a man who generally purchases oxen for slaughter, in which case it can be presumed that he also purchased this ox for slaughter, or if he is a man who generally purchases oxen for plowing, in which case it can be presumed that he also purchased this ox for plowing. Now here you're expecting the seller to know something about the buyer, which if it's a small town and these people all know each other, have known each other for many, many years, it would be obvious that the seller would be expected to have some knowledge about the buyer, in distinction to a situation where the buyer is unknown to the seller. There'd be no reason for him to know what the guy's buying the ox for. Now the Gemara answers that proposition that our dispute in this, I don't know if it's a Mishna or Bryce, it doesn't say, just an Amoraic dispute, but our dispute concerns a man who sometimes purchases oxen for this purpose and sometimes for that purpose. And so it is uncertain for which purpose he purchased this ox. So the Gemara persists, okay, but let us see the payment he made. How much was it? Since an ox fit for plowing costs more than one fit only for slaughter, the purpose for which the ox was purchased will be apparent from the price paid, right? If oxen for the plow, which are going to be used for many years, cost $2,000, and oxen that are sold for slaughter cost $1,000, and this guy paid $2,000 to the seller, so he's going to have a good claim. You knew I was going to use it for the plow, and you didn't tell me it was a habitual gorer. I want my money back, and he's going to have a good argument because the price suggests that it would be used for plowing. And the Gemara answers, no, it is still necessary to discuss the case where the price of an ox for slaughter for its meat has appreciated and reached the value of an ox for plowing. We can't tell from the discrepancy in price because the discrepancy has disappeared. For whatever reason, people are hungry, meat is scarce, and oxen sold for slaughter are selling for the same price as for plowing. But if the price disparity is significant, then there is no dispute. So it's saying, correct, if the prices are $2,000 and $1,000, it was sold for $2,000, okay, we know it was used for plowing, so the question is answered. Now the Gemara asks, well, if so, that we're talking about a situation where the prices have evened out. If so, for the sake of what practical difference, they're saying, but in the case where the price discrepancy is large, then there is no dispute. So that's why the Gemara asks, well, if so, for the sake of what practical difference did they discuss the case? Even if the ox was not suitable for the buyer's purposes. In a case where the prices have evened out, even if the ox was not suitable for the buyer's purpose, he doesn't want it for plowing, he could sell it, because it's a gorer, but he could sell it for the price of the ox he needs. If oxen now for slaughter also cost $2,000, so he can sell his habitually goring ox for slaughter and use the proceeds to buy an ox for plowing. So what difference does it make? And the Gemara answers, the practical difference is with regard to the effort of selling that habitually goring ox for slaughter. In order to recover its value, who must go to the effort of doing so? Okay, there may not be a financial loss, but time is money. Time is valuable. And if somebody's got to go to the trouble of buying and selling and creating this whole second situation, who is going to have to do that effort? Is it going to be the buyer or the seller? So the Gemara clarifies, what are the circumstances of the case under discussion? And now we're on page 92b. If this is a case where the seller does not have sufficient funds for the buyer to be reimbursed by him, then let the buyer retain the ox itself in lieu of his money, as people say. If you wish to ensure that you will get paid, collect even bran, which is an inferior kind of grain, from the one who is in your debt. If somebody owes you money and he's offering a partial payment, take it because you might not get anything else. And take it because it might lead you to be able to prove that he owes to you and that you could get more of it later. So here, okay, the situation is the price of oxen are equal, and maybe it is the seller's responsibility to replace the ox, but he doesn't have money to refund, so just deal with it yourself. So where are we? The Gemara answers, so the Gemara explains the logic of each opinion, Rav and Shmuel. Rav says, this is a mistaken transaction, as in cases of uncertainty, we follow the majority. What does that mean? And since the majority of people purchase oxen for plowing, it is presumed that this buyer also purchased the ox for plowing. Accordingly, since the ox that he received was not suitable for plowing, the sale is void. That's how Rav reasons. And Shmuel could have said to you, when we follow the majority, that is only with regard to ritual matters. But with regard to monetary matters such as this, we do not follow the majority. Accordingly, there is no basis for voiding the sale. Now, we're going to get into this a little bit more, but just to explain quickly, so we do follow the majority in ritual matters, and where we've seen this before is if somebody finds a piece of meat in a marketplace, and let's say it's wrapped so that it's safe to eat it, it's obviously fresh, it's wrapped, there's no reason to think it's poison, but the question is it kosher or not? Okay, so let's say this happens in right, a religious Jewish neighborhood, and the only butcher shops for miles around are kosher butcher shops. Then you can assume it's kosher meat. On the other hand, if it's there's one kosher butchery and there's 9 other butchers that are not kosher, then you would assume that it is not kosher to eat. That's in ritual matters. In money matters, we don't use that kind of a principle because the money is resting with one of the parties, right? Whenever there's a financial dispute, somebody's trying to get money from someone else. Money or objects, produce, merchandise, property, etc. But it's a tangible thing that somebody is seeking to remove, right? The plaintiff is trying to get something from the defendant. So when you're in a litigation over monetary matters and somebody seeks to extract money or property from another person, he has to prove it, right? You have to prove it. And proving it is a higher standard than just saying, well, follow the majority, as these kinds of cases would usually turn out. So let's see how that applies here. The Gemara cites a mnemonic known as a siman. Like we've been having a lot of these to help people who memorize the whole Gemara memorize it, right? So this is woman and slave, oxen and produce. So the Gemara raises an objection to Rav's opinion from a Mishna that we encountered in Tractate Kesuvos, page 15b, with regard to a woman who was widowed or divorced and is in dispute with her husband or his heirs over the value of the payment that she should receive for her ketubah, her marriage contract. And she says, when you married me, I was a virgin, and so I am entitled to 200 dinars. This is according to, in ancient times, the standard values assigned in ketubahs to the marriage settlement that a man has to make if he divorces his wife, or if he dies, the estate has to pay her. And of course, they could agree to a much larger sum, but the minimum sum was 200 dinars in the case of a woman who's never been married before, or 100 dinars in the case of a woman who's divorced or widowed. So she says, when you married me, I was a virgin, and so I am entitled to 200 dinars. And he says, that is not the case. Rather, when I married you, you were a widow, and so you are entitled to only 100 dinars. Now, you would think that people would know whether she was a widow or not at the time that she got married. But let's say that they were a couple who moved, went to another location. People don't know her there, didn't know what happened in her youth. They arrived as a married couple. There's no one there who can testify. So it's he says versus she says that now they're in court. So what happens? He says you were a widow and you are only entitled to 100 dinars. So then, if there are witnesses that she went out of her father's house to her wedding with a veil, a hinuma, or with the hair of her head loose in the typical manner of virgin brides, that is considered sufficient evidence in support of her claim, and so the payment of her marriage contract is 200 dinars. Right? So there's not witnesses who can actually say what happened, whether she had an earlier marriage or not. All they find is witnesses who were at the wedding of this couple. And they're saying, okay, well, most brides, if they're virgins, they dress one way. And if they're, second marriage, they dress another way. And we saw her dressed in the way of virgins. So since most brides dress that way, we're going to award the money to her. Do we say that? The Gemara infers the reason that she receives 200 dinars is that there are witnesses to her claim. Therefore, if there were no witnesses, her claim would not be successful. And the Gemara asks, but why would it not be successful? Let us say that since there is an uncertainty, one should follow the majority. In this case, the majority of women, meaning since the majority of women marry as virgins, at least in that part of the world at that time, most marriages that actually happened were first marriages because it was unusual for people to get married a second time. Divorce was very rare, right? Obviously, people die and then they remarry because they're widowed, but that's much less common than regular marriages, right? Regular first marriages with a woman it's her first marriage. So since most marriages right? Weddings. Most weddings are of women who are marrying for the first time, and you're saying we should follow the majority. So award her the 200 dinars because in most cases she's telling the truth. Ravina said, in this case, one cannot decide the case based on the majority of women because there is room to say that it is so that the majority of women marry as virgins and only a minority marry as widows or non-virgins. But it is also the case that there is an additional presumption. The marriage of anyone who marries as a virgin generates publicity of that fact. And with regard to this woman who is in a dispute over the value of her marriage contract because her marriage did not generate publicity of her marrying as a virgin, the ability to apply what is true of the majority of women in her case has now been undermined. Accordingly, there is no proof that the majority is not followed in monetary matters. In other words, if you could say, okay, well, you're saying your argument is in the majority of cases she would be somebody marrying for the first time, so we should believe her, then you could say, okay, well, in the majority of cases when women marry for the first time, it's easy to procure witnesses who knew that. And since she can't produce those witnesses, it must be that the majority assumption you made doesn't apply here. The majority assumptions cancel each other out. Now, the Gemara questions is, if it is really true that the marriage of anyone who marries as a virgin generates publicity of the fact that it's her first marriage, she's going from her father's house, they just mean, we're not talking about people's private lives. They're talking that she's going from her father's house to her husband's house. Now, if it is really true that the marriage of anyone who marries as a virgin generates publicity of that fact, then even when there are witnesses that she was a virgin bride, what of it? From the fact that her marriage did not generate publicity of her marrying as a virgin, perforce, they are false witnesses. If we are going to say that the majority is a principle that we follow, then if somebody comes and testifies that the majority outcome didn't happen, maybe it's because they are false witnesses. Rather, one must modify the above argument to say that the majority of marriages of women who marry as virgins generate publicity of that fact. And with regard to this woman, since her marriage did not generate publicity of her having been married as a virgin, the ability to apply what is true of the majority of women in her case is undermined. Come in here, another challenge to Rav's opinion from a Baraisa, right? And let me just read the note to you. Is it explained? The majority is undermined. Right. Tosafos explained that even though the ability to follow the majority is undermined, it is not entirely negated. Ultimately, the fact that that's not the principle I'm looking for. I just want to tell you that generally, I know I read it. Yeah. So with regard to ritual matters, and I gave you the example of the meat, and so in ritual matters we follow the majority, but with regard to monetary matters we do not. In monetary matters, there's the additional factor that one of the parties is currently in possession of the money. And that possession provides him with the advantage and places the burden of proof on the plaintiff. What I was saying to you earlier, that's why, because there's a plaintiff and a defendant, and one is seeking to extract money from the other to change the status quo, that's the one who bears the burden of proof. Whereas in the ritual matter question, we can't follow the majority because it's not the same kind of plaintiff and defendant. Now, there can be a ritual question obviously involved in monetary matters where you would say, yeah, but, I thought I was buying kosher meat and it wasn't. And the seller can say, well, the majority of the meat that I received, there was a mistake made, it wasn't my fault. Okay. But there, you have to prove that the guy made a mistake because you're trying to get money from him. It is a monetary matter, even if it rests on a ritual question. So just keep in mind that we don't make majority assumptions when a higher burden of proof is required. Now, come in here, another challenge to Rav's opinion from a Baraisa, right? So they weren't able to sustain that we should follow the majority. In the case of the seeds that sprout or don't sprout, or the person who buys the Gemara opens with the case of an ox, and most people purchase oxen for plowing. How is the seller to know that, he should have mentioned that it's a goring ox? maybe the seller didn't even know that. The question is he going to be financially liable? And he wouldn't be if it was purchased for slaughter, would be if it was purchased for plowing. Okay, now let's hear another type of case that can help us understand whether we can follow the majority or not. Come in here, another challenge to Rav's opinion from a Baraisa. In the case of one who sells a slave to another, and thank God slavery, at least as a legal matter, is gone from this world. I hope we can clean up the world and get it gone from the world, period. But when slavery was common in the world and legal, you had cases like this. In the case of one who sells a slave to another, and the slave is found to be a thief or a gambler, and the buyer does not wish to have such a slave, nevertheless, it has come to him, i.e., the slave is acquired by the one who purchased him, and the transaction is non-refundable. Now, you would think, well, wait a minute. If it's undesirable to have a slave with bad habits, right, like gambling and stealing, definitely not the kind of habit you're looking for in a slave, if you're a slave owner, God forbid, then you would think that if the seller didn't know or didn't tell you that the slave had these habits, that either way, you should be entitled to get a refund because this is so undesirable in slaves. On the other hand, if but they say no. By contrast, they say no. You don't get a refund, and they'll explain why in a minute. By contrast, if the slave is found to be an armed bandit or has been judged and written to be executed by the government, then the buyer can return the slave to the seller and say to him, that which is yours is before you, give me my money back. And the Gemara explains the proof from the Baraisa. In the first clause of the Baraisa, what is the reason that the sale is not considered to be a mistaken transaction? Is it not because a majority of slaves are either thieves or gamblers? And therefore the buyer beware, you should know that most likely you're getting a slave that tends to steal or gamble, and you're just going to have to deal with that and control him because all slaves have these tendencies. I guess in that part of the world, who knows who was being enslaved? Or who knows what slavery did to the people at that time and place. So, in any case, apparently the majority is followed in monetary matters. Since the majority of slaves are that way, you don't have some special claim that your slave ended up that way. But the Gemara rejects this. I should have mentioned, questions or comments, get them in now because I'm done. Just one more word. The Gemara rejects this proof. No, it is because all slaves are like this. Accordingly, no proof can be drawn as to whether we follow the majority in monetary matters. I mean, that was not the rejection of the argument that I was expecting as I was reading it the first time earlier today. It's not that the buyer had to beware because most slaves are like that, and so the argument why he doesn't get his money back is because we follow the majority. Rather, this is no good example for us to draw a legal precedent from, because all slaves were like that. So that law doesn't speak to the question of we follow the majority or not. So tomorrow on page 93, we'll continue discussing why is it that the law, we've already been told, we follow the majority in ritual matters. We don't follow the majority when we're trying to extract, what's the word I'm looking for? Penalties. I mean, when we're trying to extract money or property from the defendant, there we don't follow the majority. Then the question is why, and how do we know that? From what other law are we going to learn that out? So we'll continue that tomorrow. And let me just see if there's any questions or comments on Bava Basra 92. Load. Just one from Marjorie. Just happened. Talking about that, we were discussing this question of a mistaken transaction, and really what was the intent of it's not an exact parallel, but it's just very similar that we were discussing something like this at lunch. So regarding just happened, says Marjorie, Young would call it synchronicity. I prefer Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. Thank you. What a beautiful pasuk. What a beautiful verse. I'm just going to read that again. For I know the thoughts, meaning the plans, that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. Spectacular. Thank you for that. Also, it's funny, I shared a nugget from Pirkei Avos, from the Mishna in a video on Instagram. I mentioned this yesterday. I just shared it and a few days ago, and I see people talking. Somebody mentioned, who is wise? So Ben Zoma in Pirkei Avos 4:1 says, who is wise? One who learns from every person. But elsewhere in the Gemara, Masechta Tamid, it says, who is wise? One who sees the birth of things, or the births of things. In other words, one who sees the future. So much of what we've been learning is based on people didn't think of possible outcomes that would be displeasing to them, so they didn't discuss it at the time of the purchase and sale. Therefore, a judge has to step in and work out, who's going to bear the liability, because people didn't anticipate the future, didn't say, well, what would happen if like this? What would happen if like that? I am selling you this. I am specifying that. This is what's included. This is what's not included, right? And it's, that's why contracts are so long, because over time, all the different difficulties that have come up get worked into the contract so that people, have help in anticipating the future. Final comment from Bell. All slaves think of Zero Mastel, and a funny thing happened, which was actually based on a Greek play. Love Zero Mastel. I know there's a play called A Funny Thing Happened on the way to the forum. I haven't seen it. I haven't read it. I'm embarrassed. I can't comment on this. But I'm sure everyone who recognizes the reference is enjoying it. Thank you so much, everybody. Great to be learning with you, and look forward to doing it tomorrow at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night. Good vach.